Welcome everyone to another edition of the Cultures for Health podcast, where we discuss all things related to fermentation. We believe that the best fermented foods and beverages are DIY, and we are here to supply you with the tools you need to get started, guidance through the process, and to help you achieve your fermentation goals. I am Wendy, your host for today, and in today's episode, I'm going to be breaking down how to flavor your kombucha. Did you know that you can influence the flavor of kombucha tea simply by choosing a different tea, or by adjusting the fermentation time, or adding flavor? You sure can. In fact, there are endless ways you can flavor your homemade kombucha. It's probably one of my favorite aspects of home brewing. You're probably already aware how Cultures for Health makes brewing your personal kombucha easy with our huge selection of kombucha starters and kits. But did you know that we have special kits for each of the kombucha flavors you might want to brew at home, like white tea and ginger, lemon iced tea, black chai spice, green power, and many other kombucha flavors and combination recipes such as blueberries and cinnamon, berries and fresh or candied ginger, strawberries and basil, cherries and almond extract, apple juice and cinnamon, pumpkin pie spice, lavender and chamomile, chai spice blend, and so many more. The flavor opportunities are endless. Flavor with what you like. There is no set recipe when it comes to flavoring. You'll have to rely on trial and error based on what your personal preferences are. But keep in mind, the type of tea you use to brew kombucha can change the flavor of the finished kombucha, even before flavoring agents are added. From black to white teas, each variety lends a different flavor to the finished beverage. So what are your options? Well, consider using fresh fruit purees or juices. Because I like my kombucha to be well carbonated and bursting with fruit flavor, this is my favorite way to flavor it. Breaking down the molecules of fruit to make them as easily digestible as possible for the yeasts is a crucial part of allowing them to reach their food source, aka sugar. When you use a juicer or blender to generate a puree from fresh fruit, you're breaking down the fruit molecules, making it easier for the yeast to feed on the sugar once it's in the bottle. My kombucha never turns out flat when I use fresh fruit purees and juice. There's always a lot of fizz in my glass. Because of the freshness and pulp, a baby SCOBY frequently forms in the bottle as well, which I don't mind at all. I filter it out or I drink it straight. But the taste and consistent carbonation I get from fresh fruit puree are well worth it to me. You can also consider using fresh or frozen fruit pieces. Many home brewers add a few slices or chunks of fresh or frozen fruit to their kombucha. This is a wonderful option if you want a kombucha with a more subtle fruit flavor and want the tea's flavor to show through. This is great. However, I've observed that home brewers that use this method frequently run into the issue of insufficient carbonation. If the yeast can't get to the sugar, they won't be able to devour it and convert it to carbon dioxide. If you like fresh fruit pieces, or don't like fresh fruit puree, but don't achieve the fizz you want, consider adding a teaspoon of sugar to the bottle before sealing it. Sometimes all the yeast needs to make fizz is a little extra food to eat. You can also consider adding fresh or dried herbs to your kombucha to flavor it. Herbs are a terrific way to spice up your kombucha. When it comes to fresh fruit flavors, I enjoy collaborating with them. Whenever possible, I like using fresh herbs or high-quality dried herbs that haven't been lying in your cabinet collecting dust for half a decade. Fresh herbs are preferred because old dried herbs can give your kombucha a musty flavor. Also, because herb flavors can intensify over time as they steep in the liquid, be sure to use them sparingly. You can also consider using store-bought juices or purees or canned fruit. Many home brewers utilize store-bought juices, and I went through a phase where I tried everything from the juice aisle to the refrigerator area, frozen concentrate, and everything in between. My outcomes were a bit of a mixed bag. Depending on the brand and how the fruit was processed, some provided excellent results while others yielded a bit of a disastrous outcome. In general, shelf-stable juices, whether or not they admit to having been pasteurized, have been hit or miss for me. They've made my kombucha taste a little odd on occasion. They've turned my kombucha entirely flat on occasions as well, no matter how long I let it ferment in the bottle. The aftertaste of juices from the refrigerated section, such as orange juice, might be strangely metallic. Frozen or canned fruit from the store can have an odd funkiness or aftertaste. I've had some success when some of my bottles were absolutely bubbly and tasted great, while others were flat or had an unpleasant flavor. So the key to success here is to select products that work well with your SCOBY and that you enjoy. You may be wondering about dried fruit. If you don't have any fresh fruit on hand, this is an excellent alternative. Some disadvantages to consider. You may encounter the same problems as when utilizing fresh fruit pieces, if not more so. The dry fruit piece may be difficult for kombucha to extract sugar from, and depending on the chemicals/ingredients employed to preserve the fruit, your completed product may have off flavors. And here's something to include. A popular online tip suggests adding a raisin to each of your bottles to boost the fizziness. The theory is that because raisins are sweet, they will provide extra sugar for the yeast to feed on without hurting the flavor of the brew. With that logic, I would just add a teaspoon of sugar or use more of whatever fruit flavor you were using in the first place. This raisin approach hasn't shown to be any more effective than utilizing fresh fruit in my experience. But hey, everyone's kombucha brewing variables are different, so don't knock it if it works for you. Do everything it takes to save your bucha. Perhaps you've considered fruit jams or preserves. Many home brewers have had success making jams and preserves. Fresh fruit flavor is my personal favorite, but if you have a fantastic jam you want to test in your brew, go for it. Because the flavor will be concentrated, only use a spoonful or two per 16-ounce bottle. And what about using more tea to flavor your kombucha? Although I do discourage the use of herbal or flavored teas during the first fermentation, flavored teas or herbal infusions can be used as flavorings during the second fermentation. If your tea isn't sweetened with real sugar, make sure you add a little sugar, about a teaspoon each bottle, to induce carbonation. Lastly, another great way to flavor your kombucha is using essential oils or extracts. Some brewers choose to add extracts or oils in their recipes. For example, vanilla extract, almond extract, or lavender oil. To be honest, I've never attempted it, but my major piece of advice would be to make sure you're using food-safe extracts and oils. The more chemicals you add to your brew, even simply in the bottle, the more likely your yeast bacteria balance will be thrown off. Because certain essential oils and alcohols and extracts may have antimicrobial characteristics, you risk harming the beneficial microorganisms in your beverage. However, in lower doses, this is improbable. So now that we've touched on many different ways that you can flavor your kombucha, you may have a few questions. For example, you may be wondering how much flavor you should be using. This is really entirely dependent on personal preference. In general, I like to flavor with fresh fruit purees and fruit juices. I use about 1/4 to 1/3 cup per 16-ounce bottle. But that's not a hard and fast rule. If you have a juice concentrate or if you want a more subtle fruit flavor, you should use less. I'm going to provide for you some ratios for kombucha flavors. If flavoring with fresh, frozen, or dried fruit, start with 10 to 30% fruit and 70 to 90% kombucha. If flavoring with juice, start with 10 to 20% juice and 80 to 90% kombucha. If you're flavoring with herbs, the variety and strength of herbs vary greatly. You should experiment to come up with the best ratios and combinations for your taste preferences. For flavor extracts such as almond or vanilla extract, start with 1/4 teaspoon extract per cup of kombucha and adjust the taste. Remember, the flavor will continue to develop during the second fermentation period. You may be wondering if you should only flavor during the second fermentation. You can play around with kombucha by adding flavorings or utilizing flavored tea in your brew vessel with your SCOBY during the first fermentation stage. However, I can only recommend it to experienced home brewers who are willing to take chances and have enough of backup SCOBYs and starter tea on hand. Flavorings, even natural fruit flavors, can eventually weaken and kill your SCOBY. Dead SCOBY equals sour kombucha and mold risk. This is why I personally advise against using flavored teas or allowing flavorings to contact your SCOBY. So for the purposes of these recommendations on flavorings, these only pertain to flavors you add in the second fermentation phase. What about sugar? Does sugar content affect carbonation? Yes. As a result, this is a crucial tenet of flavor. But if you put your kombucha in a bottle, I'm guessing you're doing it to infuse it with some tasty fruit or herb flavorings and carbonate it. However, if you want to increase carbonation, flavor it with something that has at least a little sugar. Most fruit has at least some natural sugar in it. This is essential kombucha bottle conditioning. You feed something to the yeast in the bottle, like sugar from the fruit, and yeast consumes sugar and creates carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Because it's an airtight container, the carbon dioxide is contained in the liquid. Viola, bubbles. Just keep in mind that in general, the sweeter the flavoring, the more potential you have for great carbonation. You can also affect the flavor of kombucha by adjusting the fermentation time. Keep in mind that the longer a batch of kombucha ferments, the less sweet and more acidic the resulting liquid will be. We recommend fermenting kombucha for at least 7 days and up to 30 days. After 7 days, begin tasting the brewing kombucha. Use a straw or non-metal spoon to remove some liquid from the jar. Once the flavor reaches the desired sweetness or acidity, halt the process by pouring the finished kombucha into bottles or containers for flavoring or drinking plain. So what if you want flavor but you don't want carbonation? In this case, remove your SCOBY from the jar or transfer your kombucha tea to another vessel, such as a pitcher, after the initial fermentation, and add your fruit to the kombucha you want to flavor. Adjust the flavoring to your liking by adding extra fruit if necessary or allowing the herbs to simmer if you're using herbs. It's ready to drink whenever it strikes your fancy. There's no need to do a second fermentation in a bottle or any other closed container. So what if you want carbonation, but you don't want to add flavorings? In this case, put your unflavored kombucha in airtight bottles with a half to 1 teaspoon of plain sugar after the first fermentation. This will provide food for the yeast, which it will convert to carbon dioxide to make it bubbly. To generate carbonation, make sure the bottles are properly sealed and let them second ferment for 2 to 7 days. So what if you want carbonation, but you don't want to add flavorings? In this case, put your unflavored kombucha in airtight bottles with half to 1 teaspoon of plain sugar after the first fermentation. This will provide food for the yeast, which it will convert to carbon dioxide to make it bubbly. To generate carbonation, make sure the bottles are properly sealed and let them second ferment for 2 to 7 days. Unflavored brews take longer to carbonate than kombucha with fruit flavorings, so you may need to experiment with the second fermentation time to find the right level of carbonation. Carbonation can take up to 2 weeks to develop in some of my unflavored brews. It also depends on the normal room temperature where your bottles are kept. If you're looking to adjust the sweetness levels, bottle it when it's a little more acidic than you'd want, understanding that the fruits you're adding will contribute sugar. Alternatively, use a little less of the fruit flavor. Less fruit means less sugar in the final product. If you want it to be sweeter, simply add additional cane sugar to your fruit flavoring or add it to the container right before sealing it. And remember, just experiment. This should be fun. You should by all means play around with different flavor combos and experiment. Aside from drinking it, this is my favorite part of home brewing. So find out what works best for you based on your taste preferences. Happy flavoring! So with that, I want to thank you for joining us for another episode of the Cultures for Health podcast. I hope that I've encouraged you to try flavoring your kombucha or to try out a new flavor or two that you haven't thought of before. And don't forget to visit our website at culturesforhealth.com to check out our huge selection of kombucha starters and kits, including special kits for many of the kombucha flavors you might want to brew at home. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.